Good morning. Welcome to the Bike Men Minnesota Bike Walk Leadership Network webinar. It's July 15th, 2020, and we're going to talk about repurposing streets today. So I will go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get this rolling here. So thank you for joining this morning. We have a webinar this morning on repurposing streets, paving the way to long-term mobility solutions. So we welcome you to the webinar and are excited to talk about this topic as we discuss the events this summer and how different communities are adjusting how the streets are operating and doing some intentional things around that. Today's agenda includes, well, first of all, we'll welcome everyone and have you guys put your name and your location in the chat box. I have a question I'll have up on the next slide here to ask you as well. We're gonna talk a little bit about the upcoming webinars, and then we'll welcome James Gittemeier from Duluth and Chris Meyer from Minneapolis to our webinar today. So if you'd like to put in the chat box your name, your location, and what is your favorite food to cook on the grill or over a campfire? It's that summertime where hopefully people are able to enjoy some of the regular things of summer here, including that. So if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat box, we'll welcome everyone to the call. So as I'm looking at the responses, it looks like the overwhelming response so far does line up with what I had initially thought as my response. My favorite thing around the campfire, I immediately think about s'mores, and it looks like other people are thinking along the same lines as well, which is cool. So today we welcome Ted from Minneapolis, James from Duluth, Cassie from Rochester, Alex from Duluth, Maya from Minneapolis, Peter from Woodbury, Mary from Randall, Cindy from New Ulm, Luke from Jackson County, Jane from Detroit Lakes, Michelle Molstead from St. Paul, Eric Ware from Plymouth, Mike from Duluth, Barb from St. Paul, Nick from Minneapolis, and Lindsay from Scott County Public Health. So welcome to the webinar today. We have a couple of upcoming Bike Men webinars for our network. In August, we'll be featuring the topic of socially distant education. So maybe some of you have heard about the Walk Bike Fun distance learning, and we'll be hearing from Michelle and discussing some of the socially distant education that's happening in August. In September, we're going to feature our virtual events and discuss virtual events. So things are happening a little bit differently in 2020, and people are doing some creative things to still keep rolling during the summer and going into the fall. So we'll talk about that in September. And then October 21st, we'll be also holding a webinar. The topic is still to be determined. So if you have more information you would like about the webinars, if you'd like to be a speaker, if you have questions around this, feel free to email info@bikemen.org. Some of you may also be part of the Safe Routes to School Network, and Jill Chamberlain is the host for that webinar. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to her and join that Safe Routes to School network to participate and learn more about what's going on in Minnesota around Safe Routes to School. So we have two speakers today, and our first speaker this morning is James Gittemeier. He's an urban transportation planner with Duluth-Superior Metropolitan Interstate Council, or the MIC. For the past 16 years, he has worked on bicycle and pedestrian planning initiatives, Metropolitan plans, and manages the Transportation Improvement Program. He has worked on a variety of topics related to land use and transportation. He is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and regularly travels to cities around the world to experience and learn about each community's solutions to common urban issues. Welcome to the webinar, James.
Thank you, Natalie. I guess I'll just get started here. You can go to the next slide here. So, you know, Duluth was like everywhere else. And, you know, by mid to late March, there wasn't much traffic on our streets. The city of Duluth was actively looking at where can people recreate outdoors. And So the pictures you see on your screen, one is of I-35. These are all pictures that I took during the pandemic in March and April, when everything was shut down. So you can see the highway was largely empty. It was really surreal of how quiet the city was, especially around the major highways, with so little traffic on them. But all of the streets had little traffic on them. But coupled with that, the playgrounds, the city of Duluth had closed all of the playgrounds in the city. And so it was people's access to the parks was restricted. And so the city of Duluth was really looking at, well, one of the key, health measures was that we needed to be able to be still able to go outside and be active for all the fresh air, health, mental, physical health benefits that came with that. But with playgrounds closed, the trails, the natural surface trails here were still thawing, so they were closed for use as they normally are in March and April. The city was realizing that there was going to be a lot of pressure on what was left, what was still existing, what was open. And one of the few, spots in Duluth that is open, that's closed to motor vehicles, but it's open to the public, is our Lake Walk Trail. And that trail is regularly plowed, so it was something that also didn't have snow on it, unlike other paved trails in the area that still had snowpack on them. And so the city quickly identified some segments of road that they thought they could keep closed to cars or extend closures to cars, and kind of figure out how do we create more space for people so that they can be socially distanced and still be active outside. Next slide. So it kind of gets into that. So the road closures in Duluth were recreationally focused. It was just to give people opportunities to recreate outside and meet social distancing requirements that needed to be met. Like I mentioned, the playgrounds and natural surface trails were closed. There was a big concern that the Lake Walk would become overcrowded. We did luck out this year with a dry and mild spring. And so there was a lot of good weather days to be outside. So there was concerns too that with that good weather, there would be a lot more people out, and there was. And so the weather did cooperate. Marches and Aprils can be very snowy and cold and pretty gross up here, but this year it was not. The weather was really remarkably, really nice. So next slide, Natalie. So the map you're seeing here is the yellow lines are the existing trail network, the paved trails. So, the multi-use paths that are closed to motor vehicles and cars that exist. Not all of these though are plowed. The trail network along the waterfront, along Lake Superior and St. Louis River, that is the only trails that are regularly plowed all winter to maintain open for commuters. So the Munger Trail, a state DNR trail, is not plowed, and some of the up the hill trails were not plowed. So the city decided, they actually worked with the DNR and to get permission to plow the Munger Trail, or at least to attempt to plow it. It did not work. We had a massive snowfall around Thanksgiving, and that snow had been there for months, and it wasn't easy to plow at all. And so the city had to abandon that effort of plowing the Munger Trail or any of the other city trails that were not plowed. But the road closures are in red, and the city quickly focused on Skyline Parkway, so our ridge top with the panoramic views of the city, of closing segments of that, realizing that would draw people, it would pull people away from the Lake Walk, and it would give people space that they were going to need, and so they originally closed a section of Skyline Parkway around Inger Tower. They closed a section of a Park Road, Lincoln Park Drive, that connected one of our poorest neighborhoods, so that there was connection for those folks as well. They tried to spread out what was open and available to people across the city so that everybody in the area or neighborhood they lived in would have access. They They also closed a section of Seven Bridges Road, which is on the east side of town. That is a road that is closed every winter. It is not plowed. And they extended that closure. And fortunately, because there wasn't a lot of snow, most of the snow had melted off that road, and it was available for people to walk and bike on. And then they extended a western one when they realized they could not plow the Munger Trail on the western side of Duluth. They went up to the western side of Skyline Parkway and closed a portion of that road. That was an extension. So this was kind of a fluid. It happened really quickly, and then was a fluid process as this went on. And so what you're seeing really is the yellow and the red were the paths and streets that were open for people during largely from mid-March to end of April or end of May of roads. And Natalie and I were talking, and it looks like it was that was down about 2.5 miles. But when I add up the red road closures, I think it was more than 3 miles. I don't have the total number there on that. So that's kind of the network. And it was really meant to create that space, pick places that people would be attracted to naturally and go to, and that had not a lot of transportation network impacts. These are all the scenic drive. Skyline Parkway is has few people that actually have to use it from a transportation perspective, and with these road closures, there weren't a lot of people put or traffic that was dispersed and moved on to other roads. They're lightly used. I mean, there were some, and we'll go into that, but for the most part, these were lightly used roads that are largely used recreationally and not from a transportation perspective. Next slide. So the MIC, my office, we help out the city, particularly with transportation planning and with the bike and ped count usage. We've been coordinating with MnDOT in the city of Duluth for a number of years now, and are doing bike and ped counts. And we have a portable eco counter. So we put it out there on Skyline Parkway on the Inger Tower Loop to see what level of use. We have no previous counts, so I can't compare this to previous. And it was a little bit of a stretch for us on this one because our counters are really designed for trails and not necessarily, 2-lane roadways. But it did give us, we wanted to get it out there and see what we had. And so we averaged each day about 350 people using Skyline Parkway, about 150 cyclists and 200 pedestrians a day. You can see the time period we counted we had our portable counter on another trail before this, but we counted this one from mid-April till the stay-at-home order was lifted in the middle of May. And you can see there was consistent use. Weather, like all bike and ped counts, did still determine what the level of use was, but there was consistent use throughout the entire period we were counting. I would say that our counter undercounts pedestrians, and because of the distance that this, it's an infrared beam that's counting, that distance undercounts even greater when it's a larger number. So when one person, if there's a group of people that walk by, it'll only count them as one. So we know we severely undercounted pedestrians on this, but it's a pretty accurate counter for a cyclist to give us an idea. So next slide. And the reason I wanted to kind of preface that is that we saw a lot of groups of people that were, families that would come up and utilize these roads that were closed. And so this is a great picture of kind of what we would see. And if they walked by our counter, it may only count 1 or 2 of that group of 8 or 9 people. So we know that the counter did undercount, but it did give us, like I said, an idea, some kind of measurable level of use. I'd say one of the big things though, and you see this picture, the 2-lane road did allow for a lot of space. Families would stay in their group, and then other families would stay in their group on other sides. But the biggest thing that we saw on Skyline that we did not see on this road when it is open to cars is the little kids on their bikes and all the little kid devices that are out there, scooters, bikes, all of that, strollers. We saw groups of people that you'll see like a runner or just a small group of maybe 2 or 3 people at most walking along Skyline. But and with it being closed to cars, we saw big groups of people, whole families coming out, grandparents to the children that were out on that. Next slide. And here's just, people brought out all kinds of devices for their kids to ride and practice on. It was really cool to see. And like I said, we don't even really see this level on the lake walk. So just having that road closed allowed that to happen. Some of the things we learned, we were surprised, city staff were, at how quickly they were able to close roads. That was usually it's long, heated process that goes through, and this happened, in a week or two's time. Other lessons, just like I was mentioning, the increased access for senior citizens, families, especially those with young children. The city, we heard feedback on that, and the city heard feedback that was a big positive. There were ADA concerns. There were comments received about decreased access for those with mobility challenges. And I'm interested in that. To learn more, and I hope I can find out more about that. In some ways, the road being closed to cars provides more access, because that means a person in a wheelchair or with a mobility challenge isn't having to, navigate a road with moving vehicles. But there was also the view that the people with mobility challenges couldn't drive and experiences these places because they were now closed to cars. There were issues that came up. The Skyline Parkway, the Inger Tower site, is part of a bird migration study, a 10-year-long bird migration study. And when the road was closed, the city quickly realized that they had prevented access for the researchers to gain to their site to continue this bird migration study. So there was some quick processes that the city had to develop to allow them to have access, as well as the barricades that got put up. They originally were put up, which didn't allow for a person on a bike or a wheelchair to go through them. It was assuming everybody could just walk around the barricade in the ditches and the grass. And so those had to get adjusted as well. And then there was an interruption with postal delivery routes that had to get, a quick fix had to be found. And actually they had, it was a city golf course that the golf course just had their mail stay at the post office, and they had to pick it up down there to change that route. So there were some of those things that they had to kind of quickly on their feet figure out and find solutions. Next slide. This is, I like this. I took this picture because of this family that came down, and they were from a more rural township north of Duluth, but they were pulled to the road closures and walked down from their place. So this wasn't just necessarily an urban benefit. There was a rural benefit for those that lived close enough to the city limits. They came and took advantage of that. And with roads open, we just rarely see this scene here. A family, grandparents, walking a pet, utilizing these roads like they were. And we saw that not just on the roads that were closed, but because of how much less traffic there were on the streets. We saw so much higher level of usage of all the streets that we had not seen before. Next slide. I think that's my, future. So the city's not sure. They're going to consider this, but they're not sure if they would make anything permanent. One of the stretches is the Seven Bridges Road section, which is closed every winter. There are actually competing petitions on change.org, one to close it and one to keep it open. So there was a lot of things we heard. Can we keep it open in the summer? Can we do this on Sundays? And then there was also as fervent as these roads need to open right back up to cars to give us access for people who drive cars. And so this was kind of reflective of kind of where we are. Is we're split on this issue. There's passionate people for it and passionate people against closing these, and the city has not committed. They're continuing to explore, but not committed to making any of these things permanent in the future. So with that, I think my last slide is just me giving a thumbs up to this one. This was exciting when I came across this. I wasn't sure they were going to be able to pull it off on this road closure, and I was thrilled when they did. And so, but with that, I will conclude and be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks, James. These were excellent visuals for us to take a look at Duluth and see it in a little bit different way. I've been to Duluth many times and have always thought it was completely amazing and really beautiful. And your pictures with these roads and people walking and biking on them just increases my love for Duluth. So thanks for sharing all of that.
Sure.
So I'll take some questions here for James. We'll pause for a moment to, if you'd like to ask him a question or make a comment about what he just shared in his presentation. If you're on the webinar with video, you were automatically put on mute when you joined the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question, just take yourself off mute and then you can ask a question. And I see a couple of chats in the chat box here.
Hey, Natalie, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Michelle, I hear you.
I'm curious about, I'm always curious about counters, and I was wondering how can we count better? I think even during quarantine and closed or open streets, depending on your preferred verbiage, counting, this seems like a great opportunity to explore counting even more so. So any thoughts on that?
You know, there is, you know, I mean, my hope is that, you know, we have only one permanently, well, I guess we have two permanently installed bike and ped counters, one on the North Shore Scenic Drive and one on the Lake Walk. And I guess my hope is in the future that when we extend our bike and pedestrian infrastructure, that we regularly include counting devices as a part of those projects. We're not there yet, but that is my hope that it will become more of a thing that we include with our projects when we're building them. Outside of that, it is, you know, there's a lot of data available now that is becoming more and more available, of course at a cost, but that, you know, our cell phones are collecting data on us. And Streetlight is one of those where we can get data on how people are getting around without actually putting devices out there, just because cell phones are collecting that data. And I see that as in the future that, you know, we're more increasingly relying on trying to access cell phone data to help us understand level of use. But there's still, that's in a lot of ways in its infancy, and there's inaccuracies, especially with the numbers we're talking about for bikes and peds, which are much lower than for cars. It's you know, we get pretty good data for cars just because of the volume, the sheer volume of them. But I see that I know with our bike and ped projects, we always ask MnDOT if they can help us look at what Streetlight says our bike and ped counts, and then we try to go out there and validate and look at that, things like that. But we still have a long ways to go on being able to collect data in a really robust way.
Thanks, James. I think that's a key element here too. You know, it's good to know where we're at, whether the data validates what we think is actually happening. So we do have a looking ahead question in the chat box here. It will be interesting to hear about how this experiment ends up. Will you open these roads soon? And if you do, will you close them again, like you said, on Sundays or at other times?
Well, and I think I forgot to mention, all of the roads have reopened. Everything's been reopened now. And, you know, that is the hope. You know, as a planner, I hope that we are able to figure out, maybe it is Sundays, maybe it is in summertime, somehow that we are getting access for bikes and pedestrians, for people to be able to continue to experience that. So that's my hope, that we'll be able to figure that out. And I know when I spoke with City Parks Department, like the Inger Tower Loop, that's a loop. So that would be, they could turn that into a one-way and basically remove the other lane and have that create extra space for people to walk and bike. And so there's also opportunities for creativity here with how this is done.
James, I'm so impressed with how you guys have handled this in Duluth. You know, it seems like you were able to quickly implement some road closures. You mentioned a 1 to 2 week turnaround. And then also, as these different issues presented themselves, such as the birders or the postal service issue about getting through to get the mail to the golf course. You know, it seems as though you were reacting quite quickly. Who came together to make that happen, and did that go pretty smoothly? You acted quickly and were able to implement some things quickly. How did that process go?
You know, the mayor's office and the city parks department really deserve all the credits. You know, I provided feedback and input, and we helped out with doing counts. But really, it was the city of Duluth Parks Department and the mayor's office that led that charge to make it happen and happen quickly. It was, yeah, I mean, it was a fluid process, but also happened really quickly. With that, they were, you know, basically we have to create space. The decision was we have to create additional space for recreation, and what are the best spots to do it, and going from there is kind of how quickly it went. So I guess it helped that the city does close roads every winter. There are sections of Skyline Parkway and Leicester or Seven Bridges Road that are closed. So the city crews already are moving barricades on and off roads to open and close them during the seasons. And so that certainly helped it. And then as well as, so that, I guess, which should be, you know, that's where the focal point was. Like, well, crews were already going out there. There was barricades already out there. And they were able to just extend closures and then add in some more. So.
Wonderful, and I appreciate the answer to the question too, because it's a perfect segue into speaker number 2 today. So I'll give a brief introduction here, and then we'll hand over the floor to our second speaker today. So we welcome Chris Meyer. He has never driven a car in his life and doesn't plan to get a license. Originally, he's from North Dakota. He moved to Minneapolis specifically so it would be easier to ride his bike every single day. As someone who chooses not to drive, he's acutely familiar with the challenges for those who do not have the option. Beginning in April, the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board approved road closures to encourage safe social distancing on area lakes and parkways. We'll discuss the routes they choose, the response they receive from the community for these initiatives, and how this may impact future decision-making. Welcome to our webinar, Chris.
Thank you, Natalie, for having me. You know, I don't know why it took me so long to connect with the Bicycle Alliance, because I'm really excited to be here and you know, talking to you guys, because like you said, you know, I'm from Sturgis, South Dakota, which has the different kind of bike. You know, we have almost 1 million people who would normally come for the motorcycle rally there. But I knew that I didn't want to get a driver's license, and so I researched cities when I was 18 and saw that Minneapolis was close by but had much better bike infrastructure, and that's why I moved here. And you know, it was an issue just yesterday. I just started a new job with the census, and I caused some consternation because we get compensated for time spent driving and mileage. But they didn't know what to do with someone who was going to bike everywhere. We got that resolved, though, thankfully. But yeah, one of the reasons I actually ran for park board is because the park board in Minneapolis owns 48 miles of roads throughout the city. And those were my, you know, highways. And sometimes they would get well cleared of snow, or sometimes they wouldn't, and they had other issues. And so that was one of the main things that I ran on, was trying to improve the bike trails and make things easier for people who don't drive on those parkways. You know, and for the first 2 years of my term, I had made several attempts to pedestrianize some spaces. The park board owns half of Main Street Southeast, for example, in the Marcy Homes and Nicollet Island, East Bank neighborhoods. And I tried really hard to get even just a pilot to temporarily close Main Street for, I think we were going to do it for 4 different weekends. And I couldn't get that through. It failed on a 4-5 vote. You know, it was really hard to get even, you know, temporary closures for a very long time. And then coronavirus came along, and all of a sudden there was a huge clamor from all kinds of people all over the city to have more space to exercise with social distance. So people started petitions, and we had lots of phone calls and emails asking to provide this space. And we did it in kind of originally a pretty rushed way. Our staff didn't have any plans for how to do it, and we made a lot of mistakes along the way, but we also learned a lot, and I think that has positioned us better for some long-term thinking on these issues, because now everyone knows what it's like on these parkways to have them half closed or fully closed, and there's been a lot of interest in long-term solutions along that. So the photo you see here is Westover Parkway, and it was taken at the beginning of the coronavirus epidemic, where our staff originally decided to just close half of Westover Parkway along the whole length of it. And so they have those cones down the middle of it. Those are 4-foot cones. And one of the big issues that we had was the cost of those. So I want to ask people, like, don't say if you already know the answer, but I want to ask, like, how much do you think it would cost to rent one of those cones for a month? I'll bring that up later, but after you have some time to reflect on it. But originally, we did lots of half closures all across the city, and that was a problem for a few different reasons. If you can go to the next slide, I'll describe the spatial problem that we had. So this is something that one of my friends made about problems with how staff originally spaced it. So one of the defining features of how the parkways are normally structured is you have 2 lanes usually for vehicles, then trees and landscaping, a 2-way bike lane, and then a sidewalk. And when we just closed half of the road, the staff chose to have that for only pedestrians, and then the bikes were still in the bike lanes, and it caused a lot of confusion, and people weren't complying with it. Bikes were still in the road because a lot of cyclists, if they're going over 10 miles an hour, which is the speed limit on the parkways, that's where they would normally be going anyway. So we were asking them to not be in one half of it. So on roads like Eastover Parkway that were half closed, there was no place for the fast moving bikes to go when we took them off that half of the road. So we had lots and lots of complaints about, like, people crashing into each other. So that was one of the reasons that we ultimately decided to go one way or the other on the vast majority of the parkways. The half closures didn't work that great in terms of how people were using them, and they also didn't work that great in terms of the cost. Did we get any guesses? I didn't see on how much the cone rentals would be.
We have a couple guesses here in the chat box, one from Mark and one from Maya. And I guess maybe what I'll do before we reveal the answer, if there's anyone else that has a guess, put it in the chat box. We want to make sure everyone has the opportunity to participate. And I guess we didn't specifically say where you should put your guess. And if everyone chimes in on audio, this could be somewhat problematic. So we've got some people guessing in the chat box here. Maybe Chris, you can see the scrolling.
Yeah, I can see a few of them. 1995, and I saw 100. And if you had asked me like how much one of those cones cost total to buy, I would have guessed maybe like $50, maybe up to 100. But it cost us $65 per cone for the first month. And then for subsequent months, it was cheaper, but you know, once we had broad public support for different use of the space, you know, the other commissioners got on board with that. But then we saw how much it cost. And originally we thought it was just going to be a 2-week, maybe 3-week thing that we had to do that for. But then as coronavirus extended onward and onward, we made these incremental extensions. And you know, our policy is that the superintendent can authorize expenses up to $100,000, but then when it goes over that, then they had to get permission for that. And none of us really anticipated it going over $100,000. And once that happened, and you know, while we were facing all these other budget crises, we decided to just approve a total of $250,000, and then the closures would last as long as that money did. Once we did that, you know, I biked along all of the different routes and tried to find as many cones and barricades as possible that we could eliminate. And the barricades, if you want to go back to I think it was the last slide of James's slide, that showed one of the barricades that I'm talking about. Those, for us anyway, were $400 each for the first month. You can go back to the other slide. So, you know, I tried to reduce them as much as we could, and as much as possible, we went, instead of any half closures, we tried to either go fully closed or reopen to vehicles. And we were able to make that $250,000 last a lot longer than people thought it would originally be. Originally, it was going to expire in June. We were able to make it last until July 19th. And then by reopening some of the less popular routes to vehicles, we were able to make it last till August 1st, which is where it's at now with funds as they are. If I could come up with $40,000, I could make the remaining routes last until Labor Day. I mean, there's the political support to do that probably until like Halloween even, but just not the money when we have so many other pressing issues to deal with. And part of the story there is the manual on uniform traffic control design, which dictates what kind of cones and barricades can be used, how far spaced they have to be. And, you know, a lot of times I felt like we didn't need as many cones as that dictated, but our legal counsel insisted, like, if there was a crash and we hadn't complied with that MUTCD, that we would be liable. And it was actually a change in the MUTCD that has caused us to be renting these in the first place, because the park board used to own our own cones and barricades up to the mid-odds. And then I'm told that there was a change in the manual and our old ones were obsolete. So they did, I don't know what they did with them, but they got rid of them and started renting them from there on out. So, you know, that's something that I'd like to appeal to the hive mind for how you would resolve that. I mean, I feel sometimes like we have, like our decisions are guided too much by liability concerns, and especially, you know, thinking after, you know, the riots following the killing of George Floyd here in Minneapolis. You know, a lot of people put up their own makeshift barricades across the city, and there was just a news story a few days ago about neighbors on 18th Avenue South that did that on their own, and then the city sanctioned it later. I mean, I would love to be able to, you know, come up with cheaper solutions that would allow us to do this more often. And I've just been shocked by how expensive it has been for these cones and barricades. And if there's any way to get around that, I'd love to do that and make things last as long as possible. If you want to go to the next slide, that shows one of the long-term solutions that I'd like to see in some strategic places. So these are retractable ballers. They're very sturdy. They'll stop a car if you hit them, but you can press a button and they'll go up or down. And I would really like to see some long-term investments in strategic areas with either these or with gates that would allow us to open and close them easily. We have all kinds of events on our parkways. We could charge cost of this back to those permits when they get them. And for strategic areas, it could really work. Right now, the problem that we have is that this would be a good long-term investment, but we can't really dedicate that money with so many other budget crises going on. But if we can figure out a way to get it, to take out a loan for it, then I'm hoping that we can make that investment. But if we have things like this, then it addresses concerns like emergency vehicle access. If they have the ability to just press a button and be able to get through, and it would allow us to do some really cool things. Like I'd really love to have some seasonal or good weather closures. So if we could implement these and then have like a good weather policy, like say if it's above 60 or 70 degrees and it's not going to rain, then we're going to declare like an emergency beautiful weather day, and then put up the ballers at the gates and close the parkways. And I think that would really give us the most effective use to really benefit the most people if we could do that. And the closures that we've had have prompted a lot of long-term discussion about the use of our parkways that hadn't been there before. But a lot of the parkways have been extremely popular, and even the ones that weren't have still prompted discussion. Like for East River Parkway, which is a parkway that has a lot of residences on the eastern side of it. We couldn't close it fully because that would deny their driveway access. And it wasn't really well used because of the half closure, but there were still a lot of people that really appreciated the reduced traffic and have been saying, well, maybe we should just make this into a one-way permanently, and have a different use of the space, or just possibly two-way bike lane on the other lane, or return it to landscaping. A lot of those conversations have started, and it was good timing for that conversation because we're actually in the middle of our 10-year master plan for the parks. It's called Parks for All, and now is when they're accepting comments about those long-term things. So for any of you who live in Minneapolis, or even if you don't, if you're a user of the parks in Minneapolis, you can comment on that. Around Lake Harriet also, that one has been extremely popular, and a lot of people have been calling for making that permanent, as well as parts of West River Parkway. So yeah, I'm excited about those long-term conversations, and would really like to make some of those happen. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions, and you can go to the last slide, and that's my email there. I've been overwhelmed with emails lately. I've gotten more emails in the last 2 months than I did in the first 2.5 years of my term because of all the things going on surrounding coronavirus and the riots and the homeless encampment issue that we have in our parks right now. But I do care a lot about promoting bicycle pedestrian access. So if you email me, I'll try to get back to you when I can.
Thanks, Chris. We had some comments in the chat box here, and a few positive ones in support of your emergency good weather day proposal. So that was, you have some fans, the chatters. So there are a couple of questions. Somebody had asked about purchasing the cones. One other comment here, Sentence to Serve has loaned the cones out for free, and some of the work that Luke has done in Jackson, Minnesota, South Central Minnesota. Is that an option for folks to explore?
What is it that they want to ask if we can explore?
This was related to Sentence to Serve, loaning out cones for free. And if Luke, if you're on audio, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to, expand on your question, to just chat with Chris about this.
Yeah, I don't know what sentence to serve is.
So we're just waiting a moment here, and we'll see if we can get Luke on unmuted so that he might share a little bit more about how they're using that in Jackson and how they maybe have partnered with Sentence to Serve. So,
sure, and I can say if we have people who have cones and barricades that are compliant with the MUTCD, we could for sure take those. I mean, and like I said, I also kind of want to have the conversation if there are any like lawyers and engineers who are interested in the subject. I'd love to get second opinions on whether we really need to comply strictly with the MUTCD, if we could be more flexible on that. I mean, our legal counsel thinks so, but they're really pretty cautious about it, and maybe they're mistaken. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know.
Okay, and Luke is a public health person from South Central Minnesota. He made a comment in the chat box here that Sentence to Serve has provided cones for our projects in Jackson, particularly in parks and the farmers market. For example, the city typically wants a rental fee. The Sentence to Serve crew through the county offers them free through the SHIP work, so the Statewide Health Improvement Partnership. So it seems like there's a public health connection here where maybe some dollars are available. Now, we have these types of projects in this work that's going on statewide. I work typically in greater Minnesota. So in the metro, maybe there are some public health folks on here that might reach out to Chris about what that might look like to help his cause here in Minneapolis. So that would, I'm sure you'd greatly appreciate that. So we have a couple other questions. Here's one from Peter in St. Paul. There are some cheap gates along the parkway near Bohemian Flats. Can they be reinstalled and more broadly deployed?
Yeah, I think they can. Yeah, that's something that we're looking at. There was an article in Streets on that about it. And, as soon as our planning staff have a chance to brief, like they're really overwhelmed right now. But once they have some time, that's one of the first things I'm asking them to look into is long-term solutions like that. I mean, it can be gates or the retractable bollards. I mean, the advantage of retractable bollards is that you can push a button and it'll just retract right away, so it's easier for emergency service vehicles. With the gates, like you can have, I suppose you could have it automated in the same way, but there was a preference from some emergency staff for the retractable bollards. But yeah, I mean, that's something that's going to be a high priority for me as soon as we take care of some of the more immediate crises that we're facing.
Peter, did you have a follow-up to that at all? Okay. Luke also is wondering if there's any idea how much the emergency gates would cost.
Not yet. That's something that they're still looking into.
I know we're kind of putting you on the spot here today with some of these questions, but it's interesting, and I'm glad we have some engagement. We have had some really good engagement with participants on this webinar who are interested in these topics and would like to learn more. And as I have on the screen here, Chris Meier's email address, if you do have some follow-up questions for him. So I wanted to just open it up for any other questions that you may have, generally either for James or Chris, or things that you're thinking about as both of you guys are talking. And I'll call on Chris first. I saw you.
Yeah, something that someone else alluded to that I just thought I would expand on. The obvious suggestion would be, well, shouldn't you just buy your own cones and barricades that are compliant with the new MUTC guidelines, MUTCD guidelines. And I did look into that, and I asked our staff how long it would take to create a positive return on investment for that. And they said it would be 4 years of continuous use before you got a positive return. And so I guess these cones and barricades are a lot more expensive than most people would have guessed. Like the 4-foot ones, you know, and the ones that the MUTCD dictates are sturdier and more expensive. You know, they've got the heavy weights on the bottom. So I think that it'd still be a worthwhile investment for some of them. Like I basically asked our staff to come up with a plan to purchase as many as we would need for the Twin Cities Marathon, which is our biggest event in non-coronavirus years. So we could have some of them. That wouldn't enable us to do the full 22 miles of closures that we've had now, because they're kind of all over the place, and a lot of them, like with the marathon, you wouldn't have any half closures. You just fully close the road, and people who live on the routes would just have to live with that for a day, right? So that is, you know, something I just wanted to expand on, and you know, one of the options that we'll look at in addition to the gates and the wallets.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. And you know,
and I wanted to ask James, like, if he could give his perspective on this, because I just wanted to share notes with other cities. Like, how much of a financial issue was it for you to do the things that you did in Duluth?
That's a good question. When I was speaking, I spoke to the Parks Department last week to kind of go over this, prep for this presentation. And I remember early in the conversation, they were limited with what they could close based on what in-house materials they had access to. And so that there was a cost there of what they were having. And so I think everything they used were materials that the city of Duluth already had in-house, and that is what they deployed. And that also it did limit it, because there was a lot of people that asked for longer stretches of Skyline Parkway to be closed, other segments to be closed, and it was just staff resources, materials that they didn't have to do that. And so, but you know, I know that we have, you know, with usually how this works out is you're renting them. That's how, you know, with the events and stuff in Duluth, you're renting through a private company, and it can get expensive really quick. So so I'm glad you brought that up, Chris, because it is expensive, especially if it's more than just a few hours in a day. It seems that the police barricades can work if it's an event that's for a shorter period of time, just a few hours, maybe a day. But when it gets into a multi-day, months-long closure, then the MUTCD comes into play big time, and you have to get the right barricades and things like that. It also depended on the roadway classification. So one of the streets that was closed was largely is a local street, city street, and they were able to put their barricades on. And I don't necessarily think it met MUTCD because it was a real low use street, not a state aid, so not receiving state or federal funding for it, and that gave them some flexibility. But for Skyline Parkway, that is a street that does receive state and federal aid, or is eligible to, and so then they had to follow the proper barricades and designs that MUTCD requires.
Thanks, James. This is Natalie. I'm going to jump back in here for a second because I do want to take one more question for Chris, and then I have 2 more slides that I'd like to have Ted share a little bit about before we wrap up. We have about 5 minutes left. 1 hour goes very fast every time we do this, so I apologize if we're, there's a lot of people that have a lot of great questions, and definitely write down these email addresses so that you can follow up as well. But I want to take one more question from Sandra. She had a question for Chris, and she was asking about a problem that's occurring since the cones were removed. So Sandra, if you want to go off mute or post up a little bit more about your question in the chat box here, then we'll see if Chris has something to share with you about that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, what I wanted to say is I live in Stadium Village. I also haven't owned a car for 49 years, so I bike everywhere or walk everywhere. And I own property also on the East River Road near the Shriners Hospital. And I would love to see the road become one way, because every afternoon when we're in normal times, when there's about 2.5 hours of traffic, at least in the afternoon, of just commuter traffic, single occupancy car commuter traffic from the U, and then some amount in the morning. But there isn't space always. The sidewalk is inadequate in some spaces for pedestrians. The bike trail could be wider, and the on-road biking peters out as you close in on the Shriners. So one way would solve a lot of things, including that you wouldn't have to have barriers. It would let, the street could be narrowed. It needs redoing anyway. It really needs redoing anyway, but it could provide other things, although I realize this is a political thing. But I've also noticed biking that since the cones were taken down, there's a huge problem with pedestrians being all over the place, including in the bike lanes now, the off-road bike lanes. And I biked to the near north and beyond up to Lindale last Saturday, and it was horrible. There were pedestrians all over, even though in many, many cases the pedestrian trail, well marked and modern, very nice, was right next to the bike trail. There were pedestrians very commonly. So everybody's gotten very confused. And I almost wonder if we need a few bike cops just to ride that area and say, okay, hey, everybody, move over a little bit. And, we're not doing the summer thing anymore. But I just wanted to mention that it's a big problem.
Yeah, I think turning that into a permanent one-way parkway would give that extra space for a two-way bike lane. It's something that you should really consider submitting a detailed comment about in the Parks for All plan. I don't think I would necessarily use cops for enforcement. I mean, I think we want to move away from police for anything that we can, but we could still have other staff to give guidance and reminders to people on the parkways. And then the last thing is, one of the things that really became clear during this is that it works a lot better if we can have separated uses. So we really want to provide different space for pedestrians and bikes wherever we can.
Right.
Thanks for your question, Sandra, and thanks for giving some support, Chris. And if there's a link you can share in the chat box where Sandra or others could submit comments, feel free to do that, or we can always follow up with a link in an email afterwards as well to the listserv and the people that are participating in this network. So we have just a few minutes, and I want to provide Ted with a couple minutes just at the wrap of this webinar to talk briefly about a couple things coming up in the fall. So, and actually before the fall. So I'll hand it over to you, Ted.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Natalie, and thanks, James and Chris for joining us too. That was really interesting stuff. So, yeah, as you may or may not know, a lot of our annual events that Bike and Men puts on, the St. Paul Classic, Mankato River Ramble, Tour of Saints, have been canceled, the in-person events. So we're launching our first ever Bike and Men Classic. It's a free event, goes from mid-August to mid-September, as you can see. We've got a ton of prizes to give away. We're trying to get thousands of people to enter this of all ages. Really, really simple way to just kind of interact, get out wherever you are in the state. Doesn't matter. A lot of the week's challenges could probably all be done on your own block if you didn't want to go on a long ride. I'm sure Peter Grassley will probably bike 150 miles or something like that. But yeah, so we're going to roll out more information about that soon, so keep an eye out for that. And in addition, we're also doing a number of other virtual events. Next week is our chain chat about bicycle-friendly businesses. Those are awarded by the League of American Bicyclists, as you can see. And we're going to talk with Sage from Next Day Animations, which is a company of 7 people. And then Anthony from Thomson Reuters, which is a company of about 6,000 people, and just kind of talk about the ways in which they have encouraged their employees to bike to work, at least when everybody was still commuting, and you know, how they're kind of supporting that. So yeah, that'll be next week, and looking forward to people joining them. You know, pretty much all of our virtual events are free, looking to get you know, people to engage in all different kinds of levels there. And you see the info at bikemn.org on the bottom there too. If you have ideas about some topic you want us to kind of, you know, go down the rabbit hole of, we'd love hearing that feedback. Last plug I'll make too is next Thursday is trivia, which is my favorite event. So last Thursday of every month, 4:30 p.m. and we got some prizes to give away for that too. So yeah, can always find out stuff that's going on our website, bikemn.org. And yeah, looking forward to seeing some of you there.
Thanks, Ted, and thank you to all the participants today for this network webinar, and special thanks to our guest speakers today, James Gittemeier from Duluth and Chris Meyer from Minneapolis. We appreciate your presentations today and sharing your contact information so the participants can have some additional dialogue with each of you. So if you'd like to continue to join the network webinars in August, it will be socially distanced learning, and in September, virtual events. So we invite you to join us again next month, the third Wednesday of the month from 11:30 to 12:30. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.